I had a real concern, both at the national level, in which I was involved, but then specifically thinking of Michigan. How do we make the whole concept of philanthropy? And I always define it simply as the engagement, the giving, as we do in American society, the giving of time and talent, as well as treasure. Very often people sort of think the word philanthropy just has dollar signs on it, and that's one part of it. But in a sense, the bigger part of it is the sense of commitment, of sharing, and of responsibility beyond self. So that as we mature as individuals and as we mature as a society, we have to develop generations that have those values sort of intrinsic in their character. And so I was concerned with how do we build into the broad and multifaceted nonprofit sector an understanding by everyone that everyone in America can be a philanthropist. Because you may not have a big bank balance or the possibility of giving large sums of funds, but all of us can give something. But more importantly, we can give of our heart and of ourself in a variety of ways. So that it's giving time, whether it's service at a homeless center, a project in the community for improvement of recreational facilities, whatever the effort may, we could give time. We can give some of our talent. And everyone has talent. And when you're looking at a community and enriching the lives of people there, we need some people who are engaged in Little League sports, recreational opportunities, art, the music, care for the homeless, a concern beyond self. So concerned with how we build an understanding of perpetuating that American tradition. Because if we look back at American society a century and 2 centuries ago, life was quite different, life was quite simpler. And when the early settlers came, all of the initiatives were through community engagement by individuals, because in the early colonies, of course, there was no system of government, of taxation, of providing those. And so if you wanted a meeting hall, if you wanted playgrounds, if you wanted even schools initially, most hospitals and healthcare programs started in the voluntary sector and became a part then of the broader society with governmental as well as private support. So simply concerned with looking at the institutional structures of the nonprofit sector, wanting ultimately to engage philanthropy as a part of the intellectual community, the academic community, to make it a part of the learning experience at all levels of education, beginning really in kindergarten as we organize on through elementary and secondary schools, but into higher education, so then as you study history, as you study social sciences, as you engage in whatever your career pattern may be, to recognize that it's the interaction of the 3 sectors of society, the private, for-profit, industry, business sector, which is the generation of the economic wherewithal to support the other 2 sectors. One being government, and we need good government at all levels in our local community, in the village, in the township, in the county, the state, nationally. So the government has a variety of responsibilities in generating resources to carry out those responsibilities. And then the third sector, of course, is the nonprofit sector. And there it is dependent really upon the voluntary leadership in the boards of trustees who create and carry on the purpose of those organizations, their particular mission, the professional staff people who then help implement the activities related to that mission under the guidance of the governing board. And we need to have then an understanding of the importance of these collaborative efforts, institutional relationships between those 3 sectors. Yes. And so began thinking about how we as one player in the total, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, could be a partner and in some sense a leader in engaging the whole nonprofit sector and the relationships with the others. And so it was looking then at the institutional framework of the three sectors, how the three can relate and collaborate in the best possible ways to the ultimate benefit of total society. So it was thinking about those things that caused us to undertake some of the initiatives that we were involved with.
As a part of CMF.
Well, again, of course, the Council of Michigan Foundations was a creation really motivated in response to the Tax Reform Act of '69 and some of the major provisions. And I'd emphasize that there were a lot of very good components of TRA 69. The recognition that the foundations do have a responsibility for paying out, a payout provision and requirement. They do have a responsibility to be communicative and communicating their mission and their accomplishments and being open in every way about their role. And so there were many aspects of the TRA 69. One of the biggest, of course, was the encouragement of the institution we call a community foundation. And that was a brilliant component of TRA 69. So a lot of good things created the Council of Michigan Foundations. As you look at that then and look at the state of Michigan, the CMF developed a proposal. They wanted to encourage every community in the state of Michigan to have the benefit of a relationship with a community foundation. And so they looked at the geography of Michigan and the various components, and they were wondering how can we develop a vision in which that could happen in densely populated areas like southeast Michigan and across the southern part of the lower peninsula. And then you get the variation of the upper part of the lower peninsula with different on the coastlines up both sides, and then the interior communities, a different prospect. And then you look at the upper peninsula where limited population, limited economic resources across a wonderful part of our state. So they had the vision saying we need to develop a plan for encouraging communities to develop community foundations, and came to the Kellogg Foundation with the idea of a challenge grant in which we might provide some support through a challenge grant to encourage communities to think about this prospect for the future. My contribution in all of that, I was excited by the idea because they had done a careful job of planning, but I've felt for a long time that as a society, we had prolonged adolescence for too many young people into their mid and even late 20s. The whole institutional fabric of education, professions, careers, and so forth caused us to prolong the adolescent phase of life when we really should capitalize somehow upon the brilliance, the energy, the compassion, the concern, the talent of people at a younger age. And so I simply said to that planning committee, as you think about now, based upon our discussions about some of the details, would you think about how we could engage teenagers? I just reminded them that, society, when I was a kid in the late years of the Depression and during World War II, as a kid living on a farm, I had a driver's license at age 14. And then we raised it to 16, and when your own kids become of age, you think it ought to be 20 or 21. But anyway, just the idea that we should engage more positively. The teenagers ought to have opportunities to be engaged in more like adult-like responsibilities. Well, the committee then came back with the wonderful idea of a talent grant, of a challenge grant to communities in the planning process for a community foundation of involving young people. And that was the concept of the challenge grant, which created really the youth involvement. Well, simply that as you think of the nonprofit sector in particular, and the great variety of organizations dealing with all sorts of issues, that there was just possibility for young people to be engaged positively in relationship to those initiatives. You think of the areas of recreation, you think of the concerns with cultural opportunities in music, the arts, and theater, and so forth. But you think also of the caring aspects of independent living for senior citizens, people with disabilities, conservation issues, the environmental concerns we have as community, as a society. All of these can benefit from engagement by young minds and their energies and capacity to do things, and that it's best to get young people more actively involved at a young age. So we had the initial idea that it's true, as you get to an area with limited populations, you can't have a community foundation in every little village or every township or that unit, but you can have those developments at those communities in relationship to the legal structure of a community foundation, so that you can have a community foundation in Escanaba or in Traverse City or in Marquette, which then can have satellites in Grand Marais or Sini and so forth, so that those collaborative relationships between the smaller communities, where they can have an Engadine fund in their broader community foundation, people in the local community of all ages can be involved in that local unit, which becomes a satellite, really, of the community foundation legal mechanism. So we encourage that kind of creative thinking about relationships, and again, then, at the community level, as well as at the broader level served by a community foundation, you can have young people involved at both levels, so that there can be a level of engagement, so that young people, as well as the full governing board of the organizations, begin to understand and appreciate and capitalize on the opportunities for collaborative efforts. And so it was simply that vision of community as the place in which we live, but geographically it then has the potential for broader kinds of relationships. Yeah, well, you know, as I look at community life, and as you look at so-called leadership roles and responsibilities, in my judgment, every person has the potential to be a leader. And the kind of people you engage in any specific enterprise depends upon their skill and upon the particular mission or problem or issue you're trying to deal with. So if you're looking at providing additional recreational opportunities in the neighborhood and in a community, you look to different people for those skills. They're women and men who have talent, who have interest in kids, who have interest in service to others, and they can help implement the details of a broader mission. So they'll be providing leadership in their neighborhood, in getting together to develop a playground or to have a Meals on Wheels component for that community and so forth. But both the adults and the young people will be different than those you would try to mobilize if the challenge related to a hospital that was then trying to develop an outreach program with health services in a different way. So we'd have to involve people, women, men, again, who have a broader set of experiences, a different set of relationships which they can bring to the table, because all of us have friends, relationships, people with whom we deal, people with whom we play, people with whom we work, and so each of us can involve different folks in a given mission. So I just think there's potential for everyone, and that the best initiatives come closest to where the issue or the problem or the opportunity exists. And so the closer you can be to where the need, the opportunity exists, the closer you can be to having those people involved in making the key decisions. I always felt that you could never sit in Battle Creek and decide on what, let's say, a child care initiative ought to be, in a given community. If you're thinking of Grand Marais up in Alger County in the Upper Peninsula, you think of a school system there, I think, with about 75 students, kindergarten through high school, mm-hmm. and already busing kids 60 miles. There's a daycare need for youngsters, infants, early childhood periods in that community. The way in which Grand Marais develops a plan, though, has to be quite different than that which you're trying to deal with the same issue, early childhood care, in, let's say, a neighborhood in Detroit. So that the decisions, the details, so that the commonality of concern between the Kellogg Foundation would be a concern for the issue of child care, but not a prescription about how the community should deal with that issue. So I always said Kellogg Foundation should be issue-oriented, not prescriptive. Encouraging then, always our concern went back to the vision of W.K. Kellogg himself, who said that the foundation's concern really was with the application of knowledge, mobilizing the information we already have available. We know in most areas of human concern, as a society, we know more than we're doing. We know more about what good education could be and should be than is generally experienced in all of the schools. We know more about what good health care can be and should be than is generally available. The challenge then always is to take the best of what's known and see how it can be applied most effectively in a specific situation. And so the details of implementing a program have to be localized, and that's where people, and not just women and men of all ages really, do have the ability to make and carry out those plans. No question in my judgment that they do have that capacity if they see the need and then are motivated to do something about it.
Why does it work?
Well, the vision was simply, again, as you began to think of implementing programs in the broadest concept of philanthropy, we started with the grant-making resources, the Council of Michigan Foundations. But then as you begin to become more sensitive to the realities of life at the community life, where life is lived by most people, and as you began to think of the decision-making processes at national and state levels, I always use the two terms, the grant makers and the grant seekers. Or then I would say simplistically, the givers, those who have resources, and to some extent that's all of us, because we do have some capacity. We give to our church, we give to other programs and organizations that are important to us. And we then may have the benefit of resources that are greater than that, as we have in mobilizing family foundations and private foundations and community foundations. So you have the resources, the givers, if you please, but the most important players in philanthropy are the doers, those who are making things happen in the lives of people wherever that mission is serving. And so we need to collaborate, and it's not a difference. The more important, I think, from my value sense, are the doers, the ones who have a vision about something. Somehow we ought to be doing a better job with early childhood care. We need to be doing a better job in providing opportunities for senior citizens who just need a little hand up. They don't need to move from their home and their neighborhood into a strange environment of assisted living or whatever, if we can mobilize to just provide some support. So that's where the exciting things really happen. And as you think, even in a community, of saying we really need to do a better job of providing enriching cultural experiences, music or lectures and so forth. The initiatives need to come from the community, and those are the ones that really make things happen. And so we began to say, how do we get a different engagement with nonprofits and the givers and the doers? And so felt that somehow we need to see where are the common interests, first of all, between those who are providing resources and those who are the seekers of resources. Secondly, where are the collaboration among all of those engaged in nonprofit organizations and institutions? Because in a sense, there's competition between all of those organizations as they seek resources for their particular programs. So we simply decided that let's get together representatives of these organizations to talk about areas of common interest, and also recognize that there are some areas in which we may in fact be in competition. And so it was tough to think about how in Michigan, with the multiple organizations and communities, so we finally identified simply 10 organizations, sort of statewide in the scope of their activities, had to be involved throughout the Upper Peninsula, the Lower Peninsula, the urban, the rural communities, and so forth. Had to be statewide in their perspective. And then we wanted the different concerns in education at various levels, the cultural activities and the arts and the environmental issues and the healthcare issues, all of those. And we finally identified simply 10 organizations statewide, and you know, it could have been 50, but I said we just need to get a few thoughtful leaders to come together. And we asked each of those organizations to have 2 representatives if they wanted to be involved in them. First, we needed to have the chair of their governing board. Who is the person, the woman, the man who is engaged in that organization, has been engaged enough that they now have the chairmanship of that governing board, board of trustees, whatever the title. So we wanted that kind of citizen involvement. And secondly, we wanted the chief operating officer, the chief executive officer, the professional. Because in most of these organizations, youth serving, recreation, health, and so forth, you have people professionally experts in those areas, and they have a perspective that they bring to work together with the governing board in carrying out the program. So we ask that each organization have 2 representatives to come together. And so we held the initial meeting and talked very candidly about those areas of concern. Well, immediately, things that we need to have, we all have problems with recruiting members to be on our governing board, and then of training for them and continuing education for people who are engaged in the governance role. And we needed similar opportunities for engaging professionals, and how do we then have in-service training and then ongoing lifelong learning opportunities for both the volunteers in the governance and the professionals, lifelong, because expertise, knowledge is continuing to grow, and how do we, so those were immediate. Then organizations, particularly the small organizations, had concerns about how do we provide benefits for our employees. We only have 3 on the staff. We have an executive director, an assistant, and a secretary. We have 3, but they need health care benefits. They need arrangements for retirement and so forth. And it's difficult for a little organization. A big organization with national stature, you can tie in the local Salvation Army or Boy Scouts with that, but they can't if we're just a little independent group. And so there were a lot of areas. They admitted quite frankly, yes, we're competing to some extent for the givers, but the donors to the symphony are very often quite a different of prospective givers than those we might in some environmental issue or senior citizen or the homeless or whatever the issue might be. So that yes, to some extent, but that if we do a job of selling our mission and to the right people, it'll all work out well. So there was that initial discussion, out of which we set up, I think, about 3 committees. One to think about how do we move ahead, how do we structure some kind of an organization And then how do we think about sustaining such a statewide group financially itself over time? And those were task forces which came initially from those 20 people that came together, but immediately then we began to reach out, they began to reach out to other organizations because here's expertise, here are folks that ought to be engaged in this planning, and resulted then in calling a first statewide meeting, which was called the Michigan Nonprofit Forum, because we just wanted people to come together because they did have some commonality, obviously, but we didn't know whether or not out of that coming together there would be agreement that there ought to be an organization. So the Michigan Nonprofit Forum moved forward with then the establishment of a board, identification of a board of trustees and so forth, a staff executive director and then program staff. And I think it was 3 or 4 or 5 years that after that structure began to operate, the decision was made to change it from a Michigan Nonprofit Forum to the Michigan Nonprofit Association. So it was again a collaborative effort. Simply, our initiative was simply to bring people together to see if there was common concern for useful purpose. And I marvel at the response over time. If we think now it's 20 years of M&A, that the variety of things in which they're engaged, the tremendous variety of programs in fundraising, in grant writing, in employee benefits, the lists go on of activities, just remarkable. But one difference that followed in Michigan than in most states, many states have in a sense, a nonprofit organization, but the grant makers are not included. That's separate. We felt that without the doers, the grant makers have no one to work with, and we're all concerned with doing its private initiatives for the public good. And so the grant makers and grant seekers, the clear understanding is that if I come as a representative of a nonprofit organization and you're from a foundation, we don't use that statewide meeting to try to seek grants and so forth. We're there for a different purpose in that setting. So no one abuses the privilege of meeting together, but recognize the benefit, in fact, of working collaboratively.
What happens in this
Kathy,
state?
you always come down to the basic reality in life, that in the final analysis, only people are important. Only people make a difference. Any organization, any institution is a consequence of the people who are involved in it, in its creation, and its ongoing existence. So it's been a mindset from the very beginning, I think, that we benefit from collaborative efforts, and that a community benefits if the various organizations, nonprofits, most of them, if they do collaborate to the extent possible, they share, because those youngsters who are interested in one kind of activity won't be in the other one. So we need a variety of activities, and we don't need to regard ourselves as competitive always in that sense. So my philosophy personally, and whenever I was engaged in initiating any of these, my part usually was simply to get people together to talk about an issue or an opportunity. And so we would simply talk about it, and is it useful to think about this, or the ways in which we can work together collaboratively to the greater benefit of all. And I think it's a mindset that we tried to build into the structure, and that people continually have seen the benefit of that kind of a mindset. Initially, I had the vision of saying we need to get the grant makers together, and because we didn't know each other, we didn't know how to work together, how to even collaborate in programming. let alone in the broader structure of society. Then to think about the ways in which the grant makers and the grant seekers, nonprofit organizations could work together. The other two areas that I've always concerned about then materialized in one, the Michigan Community Service Commission, which really tried to bring the public sector of government together with the nonprofit sector so that they could be collaborative. Now, over time, the role of government in society tends to change. And for a while, then governments will be expanding their role as activities, and then there will be a change in mindset, and so that the relationships of getting these and the realities of getting things done change over time. But government and the nonprofit sector generally benefit, the ultimate beneficiaries benefit from having those two sectors work together. And then, of course, the final sector that I've had a long commitment for is incorporating this understanding of philanthropy and voluntarism and its relationship to the goals of society into the intellectual world of the academic community. And we tried to do that in one initiative called Learning to Give, where you begin to put this concept into kindergarten or through high school of learning about how you analyze needs and then do something about it. And then following the leadership, really, of the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University in Indianapolis, a desire to create a similar kind of Center on Philanthropy in the state of Michigan, and to encourage the replication of that idea in states throughout the country. And I'm delighted then that in Michigan, Grand Valley State University took the role of leadership in creating the Johnson Center there. But again, important that those four entities then work together. To some extent, you could say in a few areas there may be an element of competition, but basically with the larger vision of society, at all aspects of society, there's benefit if those four work together collaboratively. So the mindset of the professional staff and of the trustees of those four entities is very much one of how do we work together, how do we support each other? Yes, each has its own role, but the M&A will say, gosh, that's really something that's more appropriate for the Johnson Center to be taking leadership on. How can we help in that relationship? And I suspect over time those opportunities for collaborative efforts will be increased. But it's a matter of mindset. And it's the key people, the spokespersons, the board of trustees, and then the leadership of the professional staff. And if you get a different person, then there'll be the challenge of whether the institution changes, because any institution or organization is a consequence of the people that comprise it. We've been blessed in Michigan, and as you look nationally, if you look objectively, and I'm able to do that more objectively now, 16 years into retirement, we are blessed. I don't think there's another state where you have those four components. Now, maybe there'll be a fifth and a sixth in Michigan later on. I don't know just what that'll be, but at least now the four in Michigan are working together beautifully, and we benefit from that.